welcome to our Switch for Good tribe out there. This is the Switch for Good podcast. And I'm Dotsie Vaush here with Alexandra Paul.
Hey.
Hello, hello. So Miss Thing has been in handcuffs again. Yes, she has. And I saw this on Instagram. Thank you very much.
Isn't that how we get all our news nowadays?
But we've talked about this, or I've talked about this many times on the show, as being queen badass, in my opinion, in the world. Just everything that you do and how you do it with your strength and your courage. Standing on the front lines, standing up for animals. But this, they're all important, but this one was especially interesting to me in terms of exactly what you were doing and why. And I want you to kind of go through what you were standing up against, the companies that you were standing up against. But there's also a very important law that is at stake called Rose's Law that I want you to tell our listeners about too. So just give us the whole experience, everything.
Okay, well, in a nutshell, because we have a great guest, so I don't want to take too much time away, but basically there was a global lockdown for animals this past week in places all around the world. And I was up in the Northern California area where we did a global lockdown, meaning you lock yourselves down to something in protest and also in positivity for animals. We were specifically, our group of Direct Action Everywhere were at the Whole Foods in San Francisco, and I was at the Amazon offices. And our asks were twofold. The ask for the global,
because Amazon owns Whole Foods.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And the global lockdown was really to bring attention to an animal bill of rights, which in it is also Rose's Law in honor of a chicken that was rescued from a factory farm. And the Animal Bill of Rights asked, and I'm summing it up really broadly, that animals have the right to be free or in the care of a guardian who has their best interests in mind, to have their interests represented in court, to have the right to not be abused, neglected, or killed, the right to live in a habitat that allows them to thrive, and the right to be rescued if they are in conditions that are abusive, neglectful, or dangerous to their well-being. So that was the big ask from animal rights activists all around the world, that animals basically have more rights. And then in Northern California, we were specifically at Whole Foods and Amazon and I've been on these farms, they both these entities have suppliers that abuse animals horribly.
That don't follow their rules.
No, don't even
follow their own. Whole Foods has a
own
specific set of rules of how they're supposed to be treated, but they're just not bothering to follow them, and there's no one checking.
There's no one. The only reason that people around the world know what's going on in farms, in labs, in circuses, behind closed doors is because of animal activists. It's not because of the USDA or people who supposedly animal welfare government groups. No, it's because of activists. And so basically there's activists facing felony charges for investigating these farms that supply to Whole Foods and Amazon. And so another ask was Jeff Bezos to support these activists who are investigating your suppliers. You should be happy.
Yeah, for free, buddy.
Yeah, right, exactly. And don't support these felony charges against them.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you for
there's all sorts of activism, and I just come from a family who's very comfortable holding signs, and we all have jail records for activism and nonviolent civil disobedience.
There you go.
But there's all sorts of way to be an activist, and you are like my hero in terms of activism.
We all do it in our own way that fits for us, and we feel like we can make the most impact. So, all right, you're right. We can't go on anymore because we have to introduce our guest.
Yes, I'm a fan of Dr. Melanie Joy. So why do most of us love dogs, eat pigs, and wear cows? Our guest today is going to tell us. Dr. Melanie Joy explains this social phenomenon as Carnism, and she and her team are working to change this seriously skewed yet socially accepted mentality. Dr. Joy is a Harvard-educated psychologist, author, organization consultant, and a public speaker. She literally wrote the book on Carnism and founded the nonprofit Beyond Carnism. Her work to end the suffering of animals has earned her awards, including the Ahimsa Award and the Peter Singer Prize. We're going to go deep into psychology with this one. So get settled and prepare yourself to let it all sink in. Welcome, Dr. Melanie Joy.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, too, for all you do. It was really inspiring listening to you talking just now.
Thank you. Well, I want to talk about your work because it's had profound implications on people, vegans, non-vegans, people, on how people look at how our society treats animals. So, Dr. Joy, you wrote the book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, which is basically an introduction to the concept of carnism. And that is a term that you coined. Can you tell us what carnism is?
Sure. So carnism is the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. It's essentially the opposite of veganism. We often assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system when it comes to eating animals. But the only reason that we learn, for example, to eat pigs but not dogs is because we do follow a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity, which is true for much of the world today. I mean, not for everybody. Some people cannot make their food choices freely. They're not economically or geographically able to. But today, many people in the world can make their food choices freely. And so when eating animals is not a necessity, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. So carnism is it's a special kind of belief system. It's what's called a dominant belief system or ideology. That means that it's invisible, as I said. It is widespread. It's woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. It's institutionalized. That means it's embraced and maintained by all the major social institutions, family, religion, state. And that means it becomes internalized. In other words, when we're born into a dominant system such as carnism, we learn to look at the world through the lens of carnism. We don't even realize it. So, we study nutrition, for example. We're actually studying carnistic nutrition. We don't see the bias that's built right into the very system.
Do you recall the moment that this concept clicked for you personally? I know that you coined the term in 2001, is what I read, carnism. So it was a while back that this concept clicked for you. And when you fell out of that specious type of mentality, was it overnight, a moment in time, or a period of time, or?
Well, I mean, there was a difference between when I recognized it as an ideology or a belief system and when I had actually stepped out of that system myself. So, I mean, a lot of vegans can appreciate this, I'm sure, where they've stepped outside of the carnistic box. They're no longer looking at the world through the lens of carnism. They're seeing not different things, the same things very differently, but they don't necessarily recognize that there's actually an ideology or a belief system influencing the way that they used to think or the way that other people think. So for me, it was similar. I stepped out of the box first, and then I recognized the ideology. So I stopped eating meat. I mean, I was looking back, I could see, I thought of myself, after I became vegan, as having been like a vegan who was kind of living in a non-vegan's body for a long period of time. Like veganism was so in alignment with my own core moral values, like it is for many people. I cared about animals. I certainly cared about justice. I would never want to inflict harm on them. And yet I was eating them and, meat and dairy, meat, eggs, dairy on a regular basis. What happened for me was that I ended up getting sick from eating a hamburger back in 1989, and I wound up hospitalized on IV antibiotics. I was really sick. And after that experience, I stopped eating meat and eggs, and then shortly thereafter, I stopped eating dairy. I didn't stop eating these carnistic products because I realized that there was an ethical, contradiction in my values and my practices. I stopped eating them because I was just disgusted because I had been so sick. And in this process of learning about my new diet, which was vegetarian, and this is back in the 80s, so it was like before the internet, I stumbled upon information about animal agriculture. And what I learned shocked and horrified me. I could not believe what was going on in the world. I could not believe that I had spent my entire life essentially being blind to what was right in front of me, willfully blind without knowing that. And so, but what shocked me in some ways even more was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning wanted to hear what I had to say. You know, they would tell me, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal, or they call me a crazy vegan hippie propagandist. And these were people just like I had been, who were rational, caring people. And, you know, but they would just shut down when it came to talking about this issue. The defensiveness was so intense. And this was what ultimately led me to do my doctoral research on the psychology of eating animals. I wanted to know what on earth was going on in the world. And in the process of interviewing people, I interviewed meat eaters and vegans and vegetarians and butchers, meat cutters, people who had raised and killed their own animals for food. I recognized that there was this very consistent contradiction that people who still ate animals had, or killed animals had, between caring about animals and not wanting to cause them to suffer, not even wanting to see them suffer, and yet participating in their suffering and in their harm. And I realized that these kinds of contradictions, they don't exist in a vacuum, right? Something much bigger was going on. And that's when it clicked for me. Wow, like there's an ideology here that's really informing the way massive amounts of people, basically everybody in the world today, I mean, Carnism is its own ideology in the world today, thinks, feels, and acts when it comes to eating animals.
And there's this defense system that society's put up that you've pinpointed the 3 N's. Can you talk about the 3 N's, that this makes it feel okay for people to have this dissonance where we can say we love animals, but we can also confine them, take away their freedoms, take them away from their mothers and fathers, separate families, and then ultimately take their milk or their honey, and ultimately kill them, and still feel good about ourselves that we love animals?
Yeah, well, I mean, most people are not actually actively taking it away. They're passively, doing this through being an end consumer, right? Supporting the process of production. So there are varying levels of distance. Nevertheless, the same psychology, this carnistic mentality that I described, is at work. It's just a matter of to what degree. It's the same psychology that enables somebody to kill an animal up close is the psychology that enables somebody to eat that animal's body, even if the violence itself was as far away as, the animals' bodies are turned into, or the factories, I should say, that animals' bodies are turned into meat are in. So it's important to recognize that carnism is, it's a violent ideology or belief system. It's literally organized around violence. Meat cannot be procured without killing. And, egg and dairy production, as you know, cause extensive harm to animals. And of course, as I said before, most people would never willingly support such completely unnecessary and such extensive violence toward animals. And so systems such as carnism, these oppressive or violent systems such as carnism, and all oppressive systems are actually structured the same way. All of these isms like sexism and racism, these systems are constructed to enable caring people, rational, compassionate people, to act in ways that are completely irrational and support cruelty, to do so without fully realizing what they're doing. And so what carnism does is it uses these defense mechanisms. These carnistic defenses, as I call them, are psychological defense mechanisms. What they do is they distort our perceptions and disconnect us from our empathy, from our authentic feelings, so that we can act against our values without realizing what we're doing. So for example, when we look at a hamburger, if we're not vegan, we see meat and feel appetized. So our perception is distorted. We don't see a dead animal and we don't feel disgusted. We see meat and we feel appetized. If, however, somebody said, by the way, that is a golden retriever burger, chances are that if we were meat eaters, would automatically see it as a dead animal, the dead animal that it is, and therefore feel disgusted and not want to eat it. So what carnism does is it conditions us to disconnect from our authentic thoughts and feelings when it comes to the select animals that we have learned to classify as edible. And this changes from culture to culture. So, Why We Love Dogs, the first foreign language that my book came out in was Korean. And I went to South Korea to give Carnism presentations and talk about my work. And it was really interesting because there are not everybody, for sure, not even most people, but many people in South Korea eat dogs. But they don't eat all kinds of dogs. They only eat certain kinds of dogs.
Oh, I didn't know that.
When I was saying, imagine that the dog you're eating is a Maltese, people were horrified because you would never eat a Maltese. Those are animals that you have as pets. So the same psychology is at play. It's just that different types of animals are classified as edible in different cultures, but people have the same way of relating to these animals. And so one of the defenses I talk about in my book, and Why We Love Dogs, is the defense of justification. And I refer to the 3 N's of justification. We learn to believe in this mythology that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And we learn to believe so deeply in this mythology. Most of us go through our entire lives never questioning whether these beliefs are actually true, whether they're based on fact or whether they are simply a set of widely held opinions, which they are. And so these justifications, of course, have been used and continue to be used to justify violent practices. They've been used to justify violent practices throughout human history. Male dominance is normal, natural, and necessary. Heterosexual supremacy is normal, natural, and necessary. But these myths, what they essentially do is they distance us from our natural empathy for animals so that it becomes much easier for us to support practices that harm them.
Mm-hmm. So I think you answered a question that I have that just is one of the forms of advertising eating animals that makes me the craziest. And it is the Chick-fil-A billboards. And so for those listeners who are around the world and have not seen these lovely billboards, Chick-fil-A is a restaurant that, you guessed it, sells chicken. And the billboards are, they've built a large-scale cow pretending to write on a chalkboard in 2-year-olds writing style. God forbid it was like adult writing style, because
they think cows aren't.
Just break that one down. Saying, please eat chicken. Please go have some chicken, whatever. It's different every time. And when you were speaking about the distortion and the disconnection, I mean, those are the 2 things that are happening in people's brains, I assume. But before I was vegan and I would see those, honestly, I feel like I just didn't process anything. Like it just was. It didn't make me want to go to Chick-fil-A or not. I mean, I feel like I didn't really think about it. Is that an aspect too of what's going on in people's brains, or do you think most people driving down the freeway seeing those are it underneath it all? It's a distortion and disconnection, and they actually are at a subconscious level thinking of it in that way, distortedly and disconnected, or do you think that it's just it's so normalized that it's just like ha? Because it would be like putting a white person up there going, you eat more black people, or the opposite. Like it's messed up.
What people in power have been doing, and I'm sure because Melanie's written a book called Powerarchy, you could talk more about this, but it's what people have been doing for years.
Forever.
And power is to take the beings who are less powerful and pitting them against each other. So that cow being pit against the chicken is typical.
In my new book, Powerarchy, I do talk about the underlying psychology that drives all oppression and all abuse. And this is exactly, what you're referring to, Alexandra, which is just perceiving the way that we learn to perceive certain individuals or groups as having less moral value, as being less worthy of having their dignity honored. We can treat you the way that we want to because somehow you're fundamentally different, you're fundamentally less than. And we all pay a high price for this. This really disconnects us from our authentic thoughts and feelings. It makes it impossible for us to have healthy connections with others. I mean, here we're talking about non-human others, but the same mentality is at play in terms of how humans interact with other humans. And so, Dotsie, in answer to your question about this billboard, Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who wrote this very interesting book called The Nazi Doctors, who was looking at, I based some of my research on this. He asked the question, how was it possible for these men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, nevertheless were basically perpetrating a Holocaust? How did they go into the killing fields during the day and return home to their families?
And so quickly,
in the evening?
I remember reading that, how quickly they turned over to be able to do the injustices and right.
Exactly. They develop this kind of double consciousness. So it's really, he talks about how, people who were living in the midst of this global atrocity, that was manifested as the Holocaust at the time, was they had this knowing. He called it a knowing without knowing. And I write about this in my book on Carnism. On one level, it's this zombification, this carnistic zombification, right? That we've all been so deeply indoctrinated and so profoundly numbed out to the reality of the fact that we literally are living in the midst of a global atrocity. We are walking down the street and, we are walking past trucks of body parts and we don't even bat an eye. We see billboards of people, putting dead animals' bodies and excretions into their mouths and families laughing together as though nothing at all were wrong. People who probably have dogs sitting next to them, who they care deeply about, who are no less sentient than the animals they're consuming. So, we're just so incredibly psychically numbed, as Robert J. Lifton, said in his book, that we're not connecting the dots, and on a deeper level, we have a knowing without knowing. On some level, we recognize that something is not right. When people just hear the title of my book, often they'll be like, oh, yeah, that's so interesting. And there's a connection. And why do we? And there's only so much self-deception we can engage in. It takes a tremendous amount of psychological energy for us to stay completely unaware of what is all around us and what is a profound offense to some of our deepest sensibilities. We don't realize that until we, start to break out of the carnistic box and we start to free up a lot of energy.
And how what are some of the first steps, or how can that happen to start to unravel this carnistic mentality for people?
Well, I think, with whenever we're looking at transforming oppression, any kind of oppression, awareness is really the key. Awareness not simply about the atrocity itself and as it's unfolding, but awareness of the psychology that we all carry within us that has kept us unaware in the first place. So awareness of the cycle of the defenses. One of the reasons that I started my organization Beyond Carnism is because I very much believe that it is virtually impossible to have an objective conversation about eating animals as long as we're talking about the problem from within the very system that says that it's legitimate to eat animals. We really do need to free our minds to some degree. Becoming aware of the psychological mechanisms, these defense mechanisms that distort our perceptions so that we see other animals as objects rather than beings, so that we perceive them as food, rather than individuals. Mm-hmm. Becoming aware of the specific way that our minds do this creates some space between us and carnism, between us and the distortion. It allows us to take back our rationality, and it allows us to reconnect with our empathy. So awareness of these psychological defenses is incredibly important. But it's not everything. It's for people who are interested. They can come to our website, carnism.org. We have lots of, videos and information there to help educate people. I think it's also very important for people for all of us who want to create a healthier world for all beings, to be able to have a conversation about how to do that in a way that's invitational and that doesn't create even more defensiveness. And so, this means that for those of us who are trying to raise awareness about carnism and speciesism, animal rights issues, it's important for us to do it in a way that is as respectful as possible. I know it's difficult because as soon as we start talking about the issues, people often, carnistic defenses automatically come up. This like
you don't even have to talk about it
sometimes. Say I'm vegan,
yeah,
and then you hear all the reasons that why being vegan is wrong. So it also helps for vegans to be aware of the way that carnism affects us and our relationships and our communication and why it makes it challenging to communicate. I actually have a book about this issue, Beyond Beliefs. But I think that, one practical thing that we can do is to not assume that either you're vegan and you're part of the solution or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Because if we think this way, we prevent like 99% of the population from supporting a cause that needs all the help it can get. And we can really shut down the conversation. Mm-hmm. Many people are not ready to become vegan, or certainly not ready to do it overnight for a lot of reasons that are valid to them. And yet that doesn't mean that they can't be a part of the solution and move toward veganism. So I talk in my book, Beyond Beliefs, I talk about how important it is to acknowledge people who are vegan, what I call vegan allies. A vegan ally is somebody who is not a vegan themselves, but they're very much a supporter of vegans and veganism. So some of the people who have done the most for animals and the vegan movement, in my experience anyway, are non-vegans. Some of them are people who donate to my organization that exists entirely based on donations so that we can do the work that we're doing to help create a more vegan-friendly world. Or they're reporters, journalists, sometimes who write articles about carnism and veganism that reach hundreds of thousands or even millions of people trying to raise awareness of the issue. So one thing that we can do is encourage people to be vegan allies, to use their influence however they can to raise awareness and to push for change. And also encourage people to just, often when we talk about, making change, how can we be a part of the solution? We assume, okay, go vegan. Many people get very defensive and put off by that and feel like, oh, it's too much for me. If we encourage people to be as vegan as possible, we're actually encouraging them to move toward veganism in a way that really does work for them, making it clear that a plant-based diet is, the ideal end goal. And frankly, if everybody in the world were as vegan as possible, the world would be vegan very quickly. Mm-hmm. So these are some kind of practical tips to help people move toward veganism, whether you're advocating veganism or plant-based eating, or you're a person who's listening and thinking, like, how can I move in the right direction?
Mm-hmm. Maybe the terms, the fact that you're either vegan or you're not, you're either carnist or you're not. Maybe there's because I know you, by coining the term carnist, you've given it an importance, and it's become seen. Maybe we need a term for people who aren't 100% vegan, who maybe, because we tend to go into camps of vegan, not vegan, vegetarian, not vegetarian. And
there is vegan-ish.
Vegan, there you go. I wasn't sure.
Maybe you could be like a carnist-ish.
Or veganish.
Well, yeah, I don't actually use the term carnist to describe people. I wrote that in my book for accuracy and then regretted it afterwards because people were using it as a slur. And it's also most people who eat a carnistic diet, we can say, they're not aware. Like it's like calling somebody a racist when they've been born, of course, into white supremacy. We've been born into racism and we've all internalized it to a greater or lesser degree. It's not helpful to say you're racist. It is helpful to point out behaviors that are racist or attitudes that are racist. And it's the same thing with carnist. So I actually use that term as an adjective, but not as a noun. I've been saying non-vegan for people who are not vegan, but I'm not totally sold on that either. But I also
why
like
are people
calling
defensive?
people vegan allies.
I mean, why are people defensive for the word carnist? Is it because...
Well, most people don't, because most people are unwittingly carnist. They don't even know that they're following an ideology. And it's not, for many people, Carnism actually really does run counter to their core values. They care about animals. They care about dogs and cats. They care about pigs and chickens and cows, the ones that they encounter as individuals in the petting zoos or wherever. Most people, very understandably, do not like to think of themselves as participating in, what we know is a global atrocity. So everything, and we know that people have internalized these defenses and are already feeling, resistant to hearing about their participation. So whatever we can do to raise awareness in a way that doesn't also raise defenses will really help increase the chances that our message is heard the way that we intend it to be. And saying carnist tends to raise defenses.
Yeah. I have trouble. I was in an office, and it was a doctor's office, and the doctor travels a lot, and he had photos of himself with pandas, and he actually had a Mahout certificate. That means you got a certificate in how to train elephants.
Oh dear.
And we know how terrible from our past shows about how terrible it is to train what an elephant has to go through to get trained, to be trainable. And I didn't say anything. I mean, I didn't know. I was only in the office for, half an hour. Whatever. I didn't say anything. I left. So how would you have dealt with that?
You mean, what?
I mean, here was a gentleman who, the values were so different. I guess it was, how can you bring it up, right? How can you?
You mean, would I have raised it? Would I have said something to him?
Yeah. What would you have said?
I mean, it's really, change is like the kind of change that we need to happen, we want to happen, that's vital to happen for animals, is change that's going to happen on an institutional level. It's not going to be change that happens because we've changed one person at a time or encouraged one person at a time to change. We need to be careful with how we use our energy, and basically, to use, unfortunately, a military metaphor, pick our battles. So, if you're dealing with somebody who's an individual, you don't know them at all, you have no idea how receptive they're going to be to the information, you're in this situation, he was a doctor, right, that you saw, there's already a power differential and roles, kind of established roles. It's a tricky situation. I mean, it could end up making matters even worse if he takes offense at what you're saying.
It's tricky. I mean, I
don't know.
I'm not the kind to confront, although Dotsie and I were talking earlier. I had a friend, an old friend, tell me that he swam with dolphins. And he prefaced it by saying, I know you're not going to like this, Alexandra, but it was amazing. And I decided that I wasn't going to get into an argument because he already knew what I thought, and that I was just going to let him talk. And that I have this new theory that if we let people talk, a lot of times they will see the absurdity of what they're saying. And I did put in a couple things, but Dotsie, you talked about your own experience.
But then he called you back.
Then he called me.
And repeated all of it. And you could tell that forever how many hours between those two conversations, he had really been processing it. And he was eventually going to talk himself out of doing that again without you saying anything.
Yeah, and actually, and he repeated the same arguments. But the fact that he said, I've been thinking about what we talked about, Alexandra. And then he repeated his same defensiveness, and I hardly said anything that I did. I feel like he's never gonna swim with dolphins again, even though I think I said 3 sentences about how I felt. That was it.
That's the breaking down of that defense system like you were talking about. I mean, he was doing it for himself.
Yeah, I mean, often people do if you, if you give them the opportunity to reflect on their experience and they don't feel like they're going to be judged in your presence, So because what carnistic defenses do is they work to mitigate the what's called cognitive dissonance that many people feel. Cognitive dissonance is the moral discomfort, or sometimes people would say it's a sense of guilt people feel when their values and their behaviors are in conflict. And so that's what these defenses essentially do for people, is they prevent people from recognizing that disconnect, that internal moral discomfort that people have. So if we communicate with people in a way where when we're talking about, eating animals or using animals or whatever, in a way where they don't feel like they're going to be judged, there's this protectiveness, this defensiveness around feeling judged and feeling guilty. That's what the defenses are there for in the first place. So, if we can just listen. And I always advocate or recommend that when we're talking about these issues, we want to talk about these issues, that we do so through sharing our own story as much as possible. So if I'm talking to people about, people will say, are you vegan? The first thing I'll say is, well, I am today, but for much of my life I wasn't. Like making it really clear, I don't have, what my colleague Tobias Leonard calls vegan amnesia. Right. Like, oh my God, I just fell off a tree vegan. I get it. I remember what it was like not to be vegan. And, I am today, but for much of my life, I wasn't. And then they'll say, well, why are you vegan? And I'll share my story of why I became vegan, keeping it short. This was my experience. I cared about my dog. I grew up with a dog who I loved. I grew up with animals, and I, for so much of my life, I just didn't make the connection between the meat on my plate and the animal it once was, until I got really sick from eating a hamburger. And I share my story, and we all have a story to share. And you invite the person to look at the situation through your eyes, whether you're talking about swimming with dolphins, here's, how my experience with animals and why I don't swim with dolphins.
I actually have swum with dolphins, so I could have brought that story, and I feel
why you don't
shame.
Anymore. I learned it, so you can validate that. But in the process, it can also be helpful to describe your own carnistic defenses without even using that word. I'll say I ate meat. I loved eating meat. I really did, and I did not see it. Now I look at it and I actually see it as an animal, and before I just saw it as food. And, often people will be like, yeah, me too. I do that too. And they'll really understand, they'll really connect. So anything that we can do to create an environment where, somebody feels like they're not going to be judged, where they're encouraged to reflect and reflect on their own defenses, actually, that they're using. As soon as I say that when I'm talking to people, I didn't make the connection. They're like, yeah, me neither. Yeah. Well, why don't you make the connection? Well, because if I make the connection, it's disgusting. Well, why is it disgusting when you make the connection? Well, because it's a dead animal that's gross. Plus, I know, I've seen these things on TV, what they do to the animals. It's horrible, and so it's really just helping to reflect back what is already there, but in a way with compassion. Because if there's judgment, and really an investment in I'm going to make you vegan, people will pick up on that. And it's not fair that vegans have to work so hard to bridge the communication gap. I get that. It's not fair. And vegans are an ideological minority group, and anybody who has less social power in a powerarchy, in a system of when you're dealing with oppression, has to work harder, and it's not fair. Women have to work harder when we're trying to raise awareness of patriarchy and sexism. It's not fair, but it's true. Vegans are, it's true that we're the ones who are going to do the work. We're the ones who want to bridge this gap. We're the ones who see that there's a gap. And frankly, we're also bilingual. We know what it is to live in both worlds.
Mm-hmm. It seems like we're just, as societies in general, we're just trained and indoctrinated to not ask too many questions. Because if every single person was asking a lot of questions, it would just be mass chaos all the time, everywhere. So we just are. It's just like a system that we grow up in, that it's like, this is how this is. And like I said to you before, I was vegan when I swam with dolphins, or I guess I wasn't vegan. I wasn't eating animals. That was the one. But and as I'm flying across the pool, holding on to their dorsal fin as they jump across the pool, and I'm screaming with joy, there's no process whatsoever that's going on. That's going, well, last time I swam in the ocean, this wasn't possible. Mr. Dolphin didn't come up to me and give me a nudge and say, you want to take a ride? It took years for me to go through that journey of all of the different ways that we use animals for joy and entertainment, if you want to call it that, or people think it is riding camels, swimming with dolphins, riding elephants, to really unravel what they went through to first be trapped, right? And be in that situation for me to even be able to do that. Then God only knows what that training was like. Yeah. For that dolphin to say, here, grab my fin and we're going to go flying across the pool. I mean, that's not the natural habitat or state. But even in the belief system of not eating animals, I was still not unraveling all these other thoughts and ideas and wasn't asking these questions.
Yeah, and I think, well, and he did. He said he asked the trainer if the dolphin was happy, and she said yes. And of course, if he's smart. If he looked a little more, he would have seen that she has a vested interest in him thinking that. But I think he had a defense system. And listen, I swam with dolphins too, and I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't go deep enough because I think I didn't want to. I wanted to see the happy
Nature
dolphins
in
the big lagoon. Oh boy. Anyway, so I really appreciate what you said, because I think that when I was listening to him, I was just full of judgment, and I was he maybe could feel it. And so I'm gonna, next time he brings it up, which I think he probably will at some point, then I'm going to try and be more inclusive and instead of just quiet.
I mean, it's understandable, the frustration that we vegans feel. It's really understandable. I mean, we're acutely aware that incredible, unspeakable suffering is happening every second of every day. I mean, to tens of billions of individuals. We know this, and we feel the urgency of our mission, essentially. And it is crazy making, to live in the world that we live in, to be awake in this world where these atrocities are taking place, and where we know we can work so hard. We can work our entire lives. We do. We spend so much of our lives, picking up the pieces of the mess made by others, and, not only never to be thanked for what we do, but often to end up being ridiculed. Mm-hmm. So it's incredibly challenging, and I want to really acknowledge that, because a lot of vegans can get caught up in this perfectionism, kind of a toxic moral perfectionism, actually, where we just want to try harder. We just feel like, we have to be the perfect vegan, and so hard on ourselves. And I'm so judgmental, and I should be more this and more that. And while it's, of course, really important to work to be as mindful as possible so that we can live sustainable and balanced lives ourselves and be more effective in all of our outreach, and as really to be as unjudgmental as we can be, it's also really understandable why we feel so frustrated and how easy it is for us to become judgmental. It can be very just helpful to recognize that, we are all born into these systems that deeply, deeply socialize us to engage in non-relational behaviors. Non-relational behaviors are behaviors that violate our integrity, that act against compassion and justice, and that harm the dignity of others and create disconnections between us. We're all born into, we have been born into what I describe as the relational dark ages. It's incredible to me. We don't learn, we have to learn complicated geometry that most of us will never need to use, and we don't get a single lesson on how to be a healthy, functional, relational being on this planet. And when you look at the major problems of the world today, they are not problems that are the result of people who don't know how to do geometry. So we've just inherited dysfunction, and we haven't been given the tools to do it differently. We kind of have to stumble forward and learn as we go. And so I think it's important for us to practice a lot of compassion toward ourselves and a lot of compassion toward each other and toward others, and to recognize that good people can and do support harmful practices. And that doesn't necessarily make them bad people. We all do. I have my clothes that are vegan, and they're made by, child slaves in China, probably. Some of them anyway. And I don't feel good about that. But we have to, I believe it's very important for us to relate to the world the way it is, not the way we wish it were. We've inherited a mess, and we've got to do the best we can with the mess we inherited, which means we all have to live and do live with a lot of contradictions. We need to be able to have wiggle room in our lives and in our relationships for this. Otherwise, we get caught up in this toxic moral perfectionism, one wrong decision, one selfish choice, one wrong word used, and suddenly, somebody else or we become the enemy. And this is exactly the mentality that we're working to transform in the world. And so, it can be very helpful to appreciate that none of us is anything more or less than the hardwiring that we were born with and every single experience we've had in our lives. So that's it. Like, we do the best we can with what we have.
You have done a lot of research on relationships and people treating them each other better. And you wrote the book Beyond Beliefs, which is a guide to improving relationships and communication for vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. And I was actually honored to be interviewed for your research because I am a vegan married to a meat eater. And the book was very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've always actually questioned myself. If I believe so strongly that eating animals is wrong, I am desperately in love with a man who eats animals. And if he was a racist, I would have kicked him to the curb decades ago. If he was, I don't know. But yet I somehow, it doesn't even.
Or a sexist. That would have,
you would have
one date and bye.
So I guess it's this ingrained carnism that you're talking about that allows me to accept him where he is. Is that?
Yeah, well, and it's probably your appreciation that carnism is ingrained in the way that it is, that you recognize that he was born into this system, and people are, people are more or less able to step outside of the system, and to, he's probably also an ally to you. What most people need is what most vegans need is not necessarily to have the people in their lives become vegan, even though they think that, and often work toward that, but really to have those people be vegan allies, to know that your partner or your parent, whoever it may be, is somebody who really deeply appreciates, who understands and respects you in your veganism and treats you with respect around it.
But if he were a sexist or racist, I wouldn't put up with it. And I don't know if he would say, yeah, it's okay for you to go to that march for equal rights, Alexandra. I'm going to stay here. And there is a difference. And I sometimes beat myself up a bit for having this hierarchy of that animals maybe aren't as important. Is that why I'm...
Well, it also might be, how sexist or racist somebody is. We're born into patriarchy, we're born into white supremacy, so we're all sexist and racist. Right. It's a matter of degree, all of us. So it's just, he might be mildly carnist, I would be shocked if nothing ever came out of his mouth and there was no attitude whatsoever which didn't reflect some level of patriarchy or sexist conditioning. I've never met a person who doesn't have some of that indoctrination. So it may simply be that it's a matter of degree. And you can recognize that, if you were if he was a hardcore meat eater, that probably would be very different for you. Yeah. That would be more like a real bigot.
Yes, that probably would be if he didn't understand where I was coming from and didn't support me and wasn't on his own journey, actually, himself towards veganism. So,
yeah, I have a brother-in-law who eats meat, 3 times a day, including Chick-fil-A, and is also a hunter. And when my husband and I come to visit and we go over to my sister's in his house, he cooks as if he is a vegan and has never eaten an animal in his life. Out of just pure love and respect, I'm assuming. Literally huge buffets of vegan food for holidays. He's researched all these things that he can buy. I get teary-eyed just thinking about it. I've never met anyone like him who is complete carnist who really the integrate. I mean, he's a hunter, right? So he can shoot a deer, a beautiful baby deer, right between the eyeballs. But it's just, and there's just so, I have this just incredible appreciation and respect for him, even though it turns my stomach to such a degree knowing, what he does for fun. But wow, I mean, what is that? Where does that? I mean, I'd have never really even understood the psychology of that. How he?
Well, I mean, maybe it might be that he also places a really high value on being a good host. And it has less to do with what he's hosting or who he's hosting than it does with being a good host and wanting to treat the people who come visit him in a way that helps him to fulfill that role that's an important role to him. I'm not saying it means he doesn't care, but it sounds like he's not strongly identified as a meat eater. I mean, I have people in my family who are hunters too, and they're not opposed to people who don't hunt. They're not opposed to people like me who are vegans. There's a different, I think what you were talking about, Alexandra, was more of, somebody who is actively bigoted, meaning when you were talking about somebody who's racist or sexist, I think you were describing somebody who's overtly racist or sexist or carnist, however you want to put it, and meaning that they're antagonistic to people who are different, as opposed to people who are behaving in ways because this is what they've been socialized to do and still treating people who don't follow their or share their values. I don't even want to say their values, but their beliefs, I guess, respectfully enough. But people have a remarkable capacity to compartmentalize. I mean, I know people really can compartmentalize. You can see this everywhere. I mean, this is, again, it's about healthy relationality, I guess I can say. I guess you could say that, we might have a healthy way of relating to certain individuals or certain groups and not others. Some people are incredibly kind to those in their immediate family, and they're not very kind to people that work for them. For instance, as a boss, they're a nightmare, but as a husband, they're great. Or, somebody who's like really great on a social level and they're like fighting the good fight, so to speak, and they're like working for justice, and then they come home and they're like abusive to their family. I know plenty of people who are vegan who are, white people who are not examined around their relationship with people of color and race and their own racism, or vegans who are just very actively sexist and patriarchal. So this is actually what I talk about in my new book, Powerarchy, which is the psychology of oppression, how we all are socialized to compartmentalize, so that we can treat certain individuals or groups with more or less integrity. And we don't recognize that contradiction. Maybe a better example is, or one that people can relate to more easily is the way that we treat ourselves versus the way that we treat other people. You can have people who are very relational when it comes to their interpersonal relationships. They practice integrity, kindness and fairness, and they honor the other person's dignity. And yet when it comes to themselves, they don't. Yeah. That's another form of compartmentalization.
Will you talk about, in terms of your book, Powerarchy, which came out in September, by the way, and the psychology of oppression in relation to the exploitation of female body parts, inherent just in animal agriculture in general, but very specifically dairy?
Carol Adams has done a really good job. You might be familiar with her work, The Sexual Politics of Meat, for example, just looking at the way, and eco-feminists in general, really talking about how women, animals, and nature have been all been consumed and owned and domesticated under patriarchy. And so, so-called domesticated animals, farmed animals, they're inherently feminized. And when you look at egg production and, dairy production, it's control of female reproductive systems in a pretty horrific way. So, there are definitely lots of parallels. Talking about this with people who are not really informed about what's going on in the dairy industry, for example, or who aren't not really informed about how they've been socialized to think of, cows, for example, as so fundamentally inferior to humans, can trigger a lot of defensiveness. So it's a conversation that has to be had very, very carefully. But the mentality that enables, violence, and I don't want to say violence, I should say, to be more accurate, oppression, this, what I would call a non-relational mentality, the mentality that allows us to harm other animals, to eat other animals, to treat our partner, our domestic partner unkindly, to be disrespectful to our employees, wherever it may be. It is exactly the same mentality. So the good news is that understanding it enables us to transform all of our relationships.
Have you ever seen pictures of show cows? They have the hugest udders. It's like they haven't milked them for days, and they have these huge udders. And when I saw these pictures, I was shocked because not only did I know that the cows were uncomfortable, but also because it was like men decided that the best cows were the ones with the biggest breasts, the biggest udders. It was so, talk about patriarchy and just objectification.
Yeah.
So anyway, Dr. Joy, thank you so much for being with us today on Switch for Good. Tell us about your book coming out in January 2020.
Oh, thank you. That book is called Getting Relationships Right. And I feel so strongly that relational literacy, which is the understanding of an ability to relate in a way that's healthy, is so fundamental for creating the kind of world that we all want to live in, that I wrote a book for, on the principles and tools of cultivating healthy relationships between, friends, family members, romantic partners, and even relationships in between humans and animals. But most of the focus of the book, of course, is on interpersonal relationships. So I'm really excited about that. Once we understand the tools for how to have healthy relationships, we're in a much better position to create social justice movements, including the vegan movement, that are healthy places where people, advocates, can feel secure and connected, that are resilient movements, that are powerful force for change, and healthy relationships just in our personal lives. And really, hopefully one day creating healthier systems so that systems like Carnism are a thing of the past.
And you said that one of the greatest tools that you teach in this is resiliency in relationships. And I feel for me that has been sort of the central theme throughout any sort of I guess just anything that I've done that has had a good outcome or a good ending as an athlete. People, mostly think, it just takes really a bunch of intensity, but resiliency was the reason that I was able to make it to the Olympic podium. As a vegan, right? It's our resiliency. You can literally make yourself crazy. We've all been there if you don't have resiliency and can bounce back. And then in relationships, I'm excited to read this, and my husband and I have been married for 15 years, and we're just working on some better relational resiliency over these last couple of weeks and diving into our love languages and our love language dialects and just tying it in deeper and deeper because it's easy to kind of travel and grow apart a little bit. And so we're working on our resiliency because I can't wait to read your book because that to me is just that's what it takes every single day to be successful, right? Anyway.
Yeah, well said. And when your relationship is resilient, then it has, once you focus on, what it is that creates that resilient foundation, so you feel secure and connected together. Those are the key components of resilience, relationship resilience. Then you can, everything else that comes at you is much more easily managed.
Yeah.
Well, your work has really affected a lot of people and will continue to. So people can find you at beyondcarnism.com.
Carnism.org.
Oh, sorry. Just carnism.org?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And do you have any social media that you want to share with us? We'll have it in the show notes also.
That's great. Yes, except that I think it's #BeyondCarnism.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking for? Or is it our
Yeah,
social
like your-
media?
like
The
your
social media
Instagram
on Facebook
handle.
is Facebook page is just Beyond Carnism.
Okay. People will be able to find you.
Okay. I'll put it in the show notes. So
Thank you. Ed has that.
believe me, people ask me about mine, and I don't know them either.
No, because I don't do my own, and I'm glad that you actually did ask this. 'Cause,
right. You
a
go back to the
little
team and
cliff
be like, "What's our handle?"
So,
yeah, no, it's perfect timing, actually. So thank you.
thanks so much, Dr.
Thanks,
Joy,
that
for
was
being on our
amazing.
show.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks for everything you're doing and just your very gracious hosts. It's been really, really a pleasure.
Yeah, for us as well, and the listeners. All right. Till next time.
Bye.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.